Hello, welcome to Now Tell Us. Now Tell Us is where we have guests come and tell us stories. They come and educate us on a subject. They come and inspire us, or they come and highlight a cause that is important to them and also maybe to us. And as always, we are having great guests, and today's guest is a great guest. He's going to tell us something interesting about genocide in the US. And at this point, I want to thank each and every one of you who have been watching us, those who've been sharing, those who've been giving us feedback. We thank you very much. And I remind you that past episodes, future episodes, and this episode can always be found at www.nowtellus.com. And now, this is Anthony Moirore, and I'm welcoming you to the show and also inviting our guest, who is none other than Scott Schara. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Well, thanks for having me, Anthony. Nice to meet
Hi.
you.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing all right.
Where are you?
I'm in Wisconsin in the
Oh,
United States.
that's beautiful. I'm actually in Athens, Greece myself, and
Yeah, it's a windy fall day here, so it's a beautiful time of year for color. All the leaves are changing color, but it's very windy today here.
here is not so windy, but it's starting to get cold in December. That's when I believe is going to. I mean, usually very cold. So we are just approaching that cold season.
Yeah, that's the same here.
Yeah, and please tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do? I mean, where are you? Where you are? Is that where you are born? Where you are living right now?
I was born in Wisconsin and lived here most of my life, other than a couple of years. My wife and I, when we were first married, we moved to Hawaii and we lived there for a couple of years. And other than that, Wisconsin has been my home. I have been a business owner for over half my life. I'm 59 years old now. And ultimately, after my daughter Grace died, which was on October 13th of 2021, so just over a year ago, I have become a full-time advocate in the medical freedom movement, and specifically in the hospital killing lane. So Grace was killed in a hospital, and because of that, it opened up a lot of doors for me to share the message to hopefully save other people's lives.
Sorry for the loss of Grace.
Thank you.
Um, uh, how many children did you have, you and your wife?
We had three.
Okay.
My son took his life by suicide 4 years ago, and then we lost Grace a year ago.
Oh, that's quite a loss. That's a big loss.
Yes, it
So
is.
you now only have one child?
One child left, Jessica, and she's 32. We have two grandchildren, courtesy of Jessica.
Uh, Beautiful. That's sad, and sad to know that you've been through some tough times. And it's good that we have here. We have you here on Now Tell Us, because you sharing and you having that courage to share your story and coming out open over the incidences that led to Grace story or Grace death is quite a courage, and we appreciate you for that, so that someone may get some insight. I don't know the full story about Grace, and that is why I welcomed you here to let us hear it. So I'm going to hear it straight from you, just as my listener or my viewer is going to hear it straight from you. Now, tell us how this thing happened and what kind of child was Grace?
Oh
You know.
boy, yeah, Grace was a great child. She had Down syndrome, and anybody that has experience with Down syndrome children know that they're a gift from God. She was a wonderful kid. She was very high functioning for somebody with Down syndrome. She could read and write. We homeschooled her. My wife did a great job teaching her how to read and write, and amongst a whole bunch of other things, she played violin, she rode horse. I taught her to drive a car, and she was very witty. She had quite a sense of humor, but her love is the thing that that you miss the most, and that I miss the most. I mean, she had this way about her that, as humans, it's the way God wants us to love people. That's what she did. So
Mm. Mm-hmm. That's
that's
good.
the and Grace was 19 when she died. So her 20th birthday would have been September 22nd, uh, this last September. And
Mm-hmm.
So she was legally an adult, although, she wasn't functioning as an adult. Of course, she lived with us. She would have probably lived with us forever, although it's possible she would have gotten married and had children. We had built a separate home for her on our property so that she could do that, because I mean, like I said, she could drive a car. She could pretty much do everything.
Mm-hmm. What led to this incident that
So
caused? Yeah.
yeah, Grace got COVID in last September, and that ultimately led to us taking her to the hospital because she had reduced oxygen saturation at about 88, 89%. And that doesn't make any sense because we were on the frontline doctor's protocols. We were doing the things that we should be doing, including ivermectin. But I learned subsequently, because I went into the hospital 3 days after Grace died, and there's a man from South Africa by the name of Dr. Chetty, and Dr. Chetty studied about 8,000 patients at the time when the Delta variant was going around, and found out that if those patients had a propensity to clot or produce inflammation, they would end up with low oxygen. And I have both of those as genetic dispositions. And so that's ultimately why both Grace and I ended up with low oxygen. And, unfortunately, we checked her into the hospital. At that point, I mean, I had no idea that the hospitals in the United States, at least, I can't judge other countries, but I know a lot about the hospitals in the United States. And I did not know that they were implementing an agenda designed by the government to kill people. And so we just innocently took her to the hospital, thought they even told us she'll be on oxygen and a steroid for a few days and then we'll get her out. But they did not do that at all. In fact, they followed a protocol that literally killed her. And so I'll just give you the highlights of that protocol, because then we can dig into how this all fits together. Because I said the United States is paying hospitals to kill people, and I would like to connect those dots. But first, just to share with you how egregious this is, um, they put Grace and her last day on this earth was October 13th. Her first day in the hospital was October 7th. This is a year ago now. So she was in
Mm-hmm.
the hospital 7 days total. And, at first I was with her. I was with her for the first 3 days, and then I was taken out by an armed guard on October 10th, and she was doing fine. I just thought, it's she'll be out of here in a couple of days. But what they did, when after they kicked me out, they had started a sedation drug on Grace called Precedex the day before, which, we don't know. They don't let us know what's going on. So she's on this drug. This drug is only supposed to be used for more than 24 hours. And ultimately, after I got taken out by the armed guard, we had to hire an attorney to negotiate against the hospital attorney to get my daughter Jessica in as a replacement advocate. My wife couldn't do it because she had COVID. So we had 44 hours without an advocate. During that 44 hours, they increased the dose of the sedation med 7 times. So instead of taking care of Grace, they sedated her. Well, these drugs all have a warning label on them called the package insert. And the package insert for Precedex says to not use it for more than 24 hours, or it causes acute respiratory failure. And on Grace's death certificate, the first cause of death listed is acute respiratory failure. And the hospital received a $7,500 bonus for listing that as the first cause of death. So that's sick. The second cause of death they listed was COVID-19 pneumonia, which is a flat out lie. And they received a $13,000 bonus for listing that on her death certificate. The second cause of death was, in addition to the Precedex, they gave her an anti anxiety med called lorazepam, and another killer drug called morphine. And so in 29 minutes, she had lorazepam, Precedex, and morphine in her system. That combination in 29 minutes would have taken you and I out, Anthony. So in order for that to happen, not only did the doctor, of course, had to order that med combination, the hospital pharmacist had to sign off on the order. The alarm system for the hospital had to be overridden because the warning label, the package insert for morphine says to not combine those drugs. They're contraindicated. So they
Mm-hmm.
had to override the alarm. And then the nurse in charge of Grace's care her last day was a 14-year ICU nurse. So she had to consciously make a choice to give her those meds. Now, the morning of Grace's death, the doctor had called us, and the purpose of his call was to ask us for the fifth time for a pre-authorization to put Grace on a ventilator, which was absolutely not necessary. A ventilator should never be used with COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we said no, and he had said she had such a good day yesterday, we should work on nutrition. We should get her out of bed and sit in a chair. Everything was positive. But what I'm telling you about the meds and everything is the 100% true. It's right out of the records. But what is my hypothesis is because we wouldn't approve the ventilator, which has about a $300,000 payday to the hospital, they had to figure out a different way to kill Grace. And it's because how can you be starting the day in having such a good day that the doctor even commented on it, and then less than 12 hours later you're dead? And that med combination is the second cause of death. So I mean, once I connected the dots with those meds and how they did it, I realized Grace was murdered. And one more thing, and so this is the third cause of death. The time frame of those meds was between 5:46 and 6:15 in the evening. Grace died at 7:27. So that was only an hour and 12 minutes later after they gave her meds. My daughter Jessica was in the room with her at that time, and she called us panicking because Grace's numbers were dropping like crazy. And so we screamed for the nurses to come in and save her, and they refused. She estimated 30 nurses in the hallway at this time, along with an armed guard. And all they did was holler back, "She's DNR," which means do not resuscitate. They had put
Mm-hmm.
an illegal do not resuscitate order on Grace without our permission. And so we watched Jessica called us at 7:20, hour and 5 minutes after the morphine. We watched Grace die at 7:27, 7 minutes later on FaceTime without any doctor or nurse coming in the room.
Hmm.
So that's the
Oh,
short version of Grace's story.
hmm. And I'm curious. Um, you know the system. I mean, the protocols that go around in the hospitals. But this term that you tell us is something that I'm not aware of. How do you get compensation for listing a disease or a cause of death? Or I mean,
Yeah.
make it clear for us.
Yeah, in the United States, starting on January 27th of 2020, when COVID was first announced, the government instituted a public health emergency. And by law, that public health emergency has to be extended every 90 days. So they've continued to extend the public health emergency. In fact, it was just extended again on October 13th last Thursday, which is the anniversary of Grace's death. So they extended it for another 90 days. Well, that public health emergency gives the hospitals and the doctors immunity from liability for doing these type of things. And on top of that, it continues the funding. So if they follow the National Institute of Health, the NIH protocols, they get paid bonus money. So the two main protocols that they follow that most people are aware of is remdesivir and ventilators. So I mentioned ventilators before. So a ventilator has a 90% kill rate, and remdesivir has a 75% kill rate with 3 doses and more. So if you just process that, why would unless your goal is genocide, which means to kill population groups. Unless your goal is to kill population groups, why would a government pay bonuses to a hospital or doctors to follow protocols that kill people? That doesn't make any sense. And to
Mm-hmm.
frame this in a broader perspective, the United States is the only country on the planet with over 1 million deaths. We almost have 1.1 million deaths related to people dying in hospitals with COVID. We only have 4.3% of the world's population, yet we're the only country with over 1 million deaths. The second place, so we're first place, which makes no sense. We have the most advanced medical profession on the planet. Second
Mm-hmm.
place is India. India has 4 times the population of the United States, but less than half the amount of deaths attributable to COVID in a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And their footprint on the planet, they are only 1/3. India as a nation is only 1/3 the size of the United States. So it makes no sense. Anybody seeing those numbers should quickly discern that the United States is on a mission to kill population groups. And in fact, the number one and number two causes of death in hospitals with COVID are elderly and disabled. And that doesn't make any sense because elderly and disabled are not comorbidities. They're just facts. Grace had no more reason to die of COVID than anybody else
Mm.
in a lot bigger perspective. And at this point, our goal is simply to share the story and connect the dots so that other people can wake up and um, and ultimately wake. Once you're awake, you come to grips with you've got to get right with God, and
Mm-hmm.
that's why we're sharing the story.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Drive us into that direction. You are Christian, and then you came to discover this, and then so much has gone on. Even as you tell us, before grace, you'd lost a son before. How do you go through all this? I mean, what's the impact of their deaths, and how do you respond to their deaths? And especially now, this one that you know is cost, as you say. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, how do you respond? I mean, I believe God is sovereign. So after a death, you can say that God knew the date, time, and circumstances of Grace's death and my son Travis's death. So he knew those before they were born. Of course, we didn't know that, but after the fact, now we're clued into what God already knew. So now we have a choice. And, you know, there's been the opportunity that has happened since Grace died. I mean, a sequence of events happened to show my wife and I that we should be involved sharing the story to hopefully wake people up. And what we did then was to um, just ask God to keep opening. If you keep opening doors, we'll walk through them, and if you choose to close the doors, we'll stop doing
Mm-hmm.
what we're doing and do something else. And so we have it's strange because I've owned a business over half of my life, and in business you plan. That's really the secret to success in business. You got to plan.
Yeah.
And in this walk of faith, there is no planning. I have no idea what tomorrow is going to bring, but I am you're just thankful, that God's got this, and He truly does have it. I mean, if He's passing judgment on the earth for not believing in Him, there's no reason to fear for that. If you're one of God's, and if you're not, it's time to reconcile and make peace with Him. I mean, that's the urgent message that I want to share.
Mm-hmm. And what's your, I mean, thought on the doctors? Did you, now that you got to know them personally, those that you witnessed taking the life of your daughter, what was your response to them, and how do you take it as you move along?
Well, thankfully, I was in a different hospital after Grace died. So 3 days after Grace died, I just about died, and the hospital that I was in saved my life. And I think God put me there so that I could tell this story objectively to see what's supposed to be done versus what is being done and what took Grace's life. But then what happened to me while I was in the hospital is God, he obviously knew I was going to get out and start speaking about this, and he put a spirit of forgiveness in me. So relative to the specific doctor and nurse who killed Grace, um, what my hope is that they repent. So he gave me a spirit of forgiveness. I mean, that's the gospel, not
Mm-hmm.
literally the spirit of forgiveness, but gospel message is, very simply, Jesus died, rose again on the third day so that whoever believes. Well, what's the benefit of that? Of course, eternal life, but what a benefit on earth. Once you realize that the door opens up to you to do things that you could never do. So no man, if you know the doctor and nurse who killed your daughter, you can't forgive them as a man. Nobody can. That's impossible. But God
Mm-hmm.
can. And so he worked that into my heart. And so I mean, that's, you can't have an angry, he knew, I mean, he obviously knows you can't have an angry dad out here screaming at the doctor and nurse who killed Grace. I mean, that's not going to fly if we're trying to help people. So, thankfully he gave me that without even asking.
Mm. So you did not attempt to go in any way like sue, although now you told us that they are under the government's protection over whatever it is that happens.
Yeah,
That's what.
that's a great question. So at the beginning, right after we got the records and I went through the records, I thought it was my biblical responsibility. At this point, I was pretty naive. I just thought Grace's death was an anomaly. So I
Mm-hmm.
sent them everything that I had assembled with the help of a doctor, and I sent it to the hospital, requesting a meeting with the hospital CEO and the doctor, thinking that they would want to know what I know so that they can stop it. So I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that was pretty naive. Well, they rejected the meeting, and then that set a sequence of events in motion that, ultimately we concluded that Grace was murdered. So then we looked into what does justice look like with our system, and found out about the immunity from liability under the PrEP Act and all the things that make it near impossible to sue. But then as God opened up doors, he kept doing it. We were introduced to some attorneys who saw Grace's case through a different lens. And so that's being pursued now. They have told me don't talk about the case at all on the air. So uh, we'll see where that goes. I'm not, of course, putting faith in our legal system because that was designed by man. But if God is behind it, I would suspect that we will win, and it will be for the benefit of a lot of people.
Yeah. And since you have proof and also you've done quite a research, as you say, into everything that you are putting forth here. So it's our desire that you get justice for what has happened to your daughter. And you sharing this story, apart from sensitizing the public on what goes on and making us aware of what runs behind those doors, what action would you maybe want the public to take, or an idea that you have in highlighting this cause?
Yeah, a simple action is advocacy. So the first and most important action is you have to change your belief.
Mm-hmm.
So just the way God wired us, our beliefs motivate our actions. So whatever you believe, your feet follow. I mean, that's like 1 + 1 = 2.
Mm-hmm.
So if you believe that the hospitals have your best interest in mind, you'll never take Grace's story seriously. You would look at it and say, well, that was just an exception, because
Mm-hmm.
they would never do that. But if you look at it through the lens that they are the new killing fields being paid to kill by the government, well, now that changes your perspective. And so you have to adopt a new belief first. Well, then the encouragement I'd give people, so you think, well, I can't go to the hospital. Well, there's going to be times where you're going to have to go to the hospital. It's not even an option. But what I would tell you is get your documents done ahead of time. Make sure you've got the power of attorneys in place. that the end of life documents don't give the hospital permissions that they should not have, and you have to have a physical advocate with you or on the phone the entire time. You cannot trust them. And that is, the old paradigm of advocacy, which I was in when I took Grace in the hospital, is that I'm there for my best buddy, and I'm just there so that we can, make her stay in the hospital more comfortable. You don't want to be alone in a hospital. That's how
Mm-hmm.
I perceived advocacy. How I perceive advocacy today, having been through that, and this is the paradigm I'd encourage people to operate under, is that they do not have your best interest in mind. They are not following the Hippocratic Oath. So you have to have the best interest of your loved one in mind and challenge everything. And
Mm-hmm.
if they do not follow the directives that you give, get your loved one out of that hospital and get them transferred to another hospital. It is not the time to be nice and get along with the hospital staff. You've got to stand your ground. Grace, I did stand my ground. I got taken out by an armed guard. But if I would have had the perspective that they were trying to murder her, I would have, when I got taken out, I would have taken her with me, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as reminding us that there's a higher power than the doctors or the government, the higher power that gave us life, and the one that can be more responsible than the human being. And that's God, reminding us to look upon Him in everything that we do and depend upon Him and trust Him. That's a good lesson I think that we can get from this episode.
Well, I think that's right on, Anthony. That's a great close. I mean, when I put the light 100% on me, I trusted the white coat instead of God. And
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, my daughter is dead because of that. And that doesn't excuse their behavior, but it's important that you don't lose the connection with God. It's meant to be a 24/7 connection. Grace had that.
Mm-hmm.
As men, I mean, my best or my worst quality is being a stubborn man. So as a stubborn man, I mean, you want to do things on your own, and God, God doesn't want that. He wants you to rely on Him.
Mm. Yeah, so uh, we feel you, and it's tough, and it's a tough thing that you've gone through. And again, we thank you for the courage to come out and share. And those who have heard this, those who are listening, and those who have watched us may have got a thing or two from there. As we continue to learn more of the world, maybe we'll never understand it fully. So that's why we should all surrender to the higher power that is all knowing. And that's about it for today at Now Tell Us. And yeah, we thank Scott for taking his time and being with us. But before you go, Scott, we would like you to leave us with a few words that we should always remember. That's as a norm on Now Tell Us.
Well, I wouldn't. We have so much on Grace's website that what I'd really like to say in closing is spend a little time on Grace's website and get to know her. We put it together as a testimony to her, but ultimately it's been expanded so much to include documentation of the tragedy. And I've been studying the Holocaust, so there's research on the Holocaust and how the country is going through the world is going through a second Holocaust, but this time it's worldwide. So I'd like people to go to the website, which is ouramazinggrace.net. And the ultimately at the end, the most important thing that I could ever tell anybody is to reconcile with God. And ultimately, that means to come to grips with what God's plan for salvation is, which I laid out before. What is the gospel? Jesus came to this earth for a reason. He died, was buried, and rose on the third day. And those who believe in him will have eternal life. And then there's no reason to fear what we are going through now. We're going through some times that are like no other, and they're going to get substantially worse. And he He takes the fear away if you put your trust in him.
Amen. So that's about it for today. Remember to go to www.ouramazinggrace.net to learn more about Grace story. There are videos there. There's so much to see from that website that you can learn much more about that. And that's about it at Now Tell Us. And I've been your host, Anthony Morore. And together with our guest, Scott Schara, we are saying bye for now.
Bye, Anthony. Thank you.
Bye.